So today we're obviously covering some year-end strategy for Sage 500. We'll talk some about generalities, things you should consider regardless of ERP system, and then we'll focus on Sage 500 specific tasks that we want you to be mindful of at each year end. So today's agenda, we'll start off with things that you want to consider closing the current year. We'll talk a little bit about disaster recovery plans. We'll cover some key points relating to processing physical inventory, current options for handling vendor 1099 payments, and also some opportunities for pruning data from your Sage 500 system. And then we'll cover some topics for things that need to be done in order to prepare for the coming fiscal year. So we'll go over how to create your GL fiscal calendar, your inventory calendar, and also talk a little bit about Sage fixed assets, which may or may not be integrated with Sage 500, and a review of security group changes that may need to happen as well. So let's drill into specifics for 500 year end. A lot of folks are taking this time of year to set aside to do a physical inventory of the stock on hand. So we wanted to just remind you of a few key items during this count process. You don't have to count all of your items in a single batch. You can split the items that you're counting into multiple batches, and you have a lot of filtering options within the select items to count task to pick how you're grouping those items together in a given batch. So you can filter based on the item type, the item status. So maybe you want to keep the items that are flagged as either inactive or deleted, separate from those that are actively being transacted in the system. If you're using warehouse zones or bins, then you've got the opportunity to filter by those fields as well. Or you may want to filter by item class, purchase product line, sales product line. You've got a ton of options available to you. So whatever works for your company to divide those up. Or if you have a small number of items, feel free to just pull everything into one batch. Once you've done the item selection, you have to freeze the counts for the items. And then you've got a choice as to how the end users will actually perform their counts. If you're using scanners with one of the warehouse automation solutions, then that's obviously probably the easiest approach. But if you're still using paper to do your counts, then you've got a choice of generating either count cards, which would be one item and or item bin location per count card, or using count sheets, which can have either multiple items or multiple bin locations for items on a single sheet. In either case, you do have the option when you print the cards or the sheets to include blank cards or blank lines for any items or bins that are not in the batch. So you may ask, well, what's the point of including those? If someone goes out to do a physical count, 500 said that there were none on hand, but somebody finds 3 or 4 of them on the shelf, you want to be able to have a record holder, a placeholder in the system to record the count for that item. So this will give you, in effect, blank lines in the enter count screen to be able to add items to the batch that weren't selected up top when you did the item selection. Once you're actually have the items counted and are ready to enter those counts into 500, you have a choice as to whether or not you want to show the user who's performing the counts in 500 the quantity that was frozen when the batch was created. There are pluses and minuses to doing that. On the positive side, having that frozen quantity displayed to the user might be helpful in identifying counts that are way off. If 500 says that you had 10 of a particular item on hand, and somebody turns an account that says that there were 1,000 on hand, that might be a good indicator that you need to go out and recount that item before entering in the item into 500's physical count batch and posting that through, right? So that would be a reason to include the frozen quantity. You may also have a concern, though, that an end user who's entering the counts, if they see that frozen quantity, may rely on that frozen quantity if they're unsure about what the counter has presented to them. So they may, seeing that frozen quantity may influence the value that they enter in the system if they feel like there may be some gray area about the count that was presented to them. So there may be a downside to including that frozen quantity. So you just have to decide based on the personnel that you have whether it makes sense to do that or not. When the user is in that enter counts task, you also have the option for displaying all of the items only that have been counted, the items only that have not yet been counted, or all items. So when they're initially entering the counts, it probably makes sense to include both counted and uncounted so that you've got a line for every item that should have been frozen and counted, as well as those blank lines that we mentioned earlier. Once you've gone through that first pass of getting that data entered, at that point it's probably a good suggestion to click on the button to show only the uncounted items to verify the stuff that you have not entered yet into that count batch. In newer versions of 500, there's also a grid that appears down at the bottom of that enter counts screen, which makes the data entry a lot faster and also gives you the opportunity to export the data from that grid into an Excel sheet. So you might want to actually use that as your starting point before people do their counts and simply pass that Excel sheet user to user so that they can fill the data in the Excel sheet. And then once the counts are finalized, take that Excel sheet that's been completed back. And if you have the Data Porter module, you can then use Data Porter to load the counts from that Excel sheet directly into the 500 task so that you don't have to sit there and beat the keys to enter each of those counts. I spoke a moment ago about using the missing count cards. If you have selected that option to include missing count cards, then you do not want to use the set uncounted to 0 option that you will see within the enter counts task, because that would eliminate those rows for those additional count items from being displayed for you. Once the counts have been completed, then you do have a couple of reports that you can run to validate the data that has been counted. There's a reconciliation report, which will show you any transactions that have been posted in 500 after the items were frozen once that batch was initially created, so that you can reconcile back between what the end user physically counted and what may have, for example, shipped out the door in the interim. There's also a discrepancy report, which comes in handy if you have taken advantage of the tolerance codes that can be set up within Maintain Inventory. So for each item, you can define an on-hand quantity variance %. So in Maintain Inventory for a given item, let's say you have a tolerance code of 3% for on-hand quantity variance. If the entered count is more than 3% off of the frozen count, then this discrepancy report will highlight that item to let you know the items that fall outside of the parameters that you've defined as an acceptable margin of error. So the other hot topic, or one of the other hot topics for year end, is generally 1099 processing. IRS has made a change to the 1099 dividend form for 2018. So they have added a new box 5 labeled Section 199A dividends. That change does require an update to the Atrix integration if you are using that within Sage 500. For those of you who may not be aware, back in version 2017, I believe, Sage added in the Atrix integration option to provide a web solution that's integrated with 500's accounts payable to be able to either report the 1099 forms, transmit those to federal and or state government, and also generate the forms themselves to be sent to the recipients, either electronically or paper copies. So Sage has discontinued the practice of providing updates to the crystal forms that could be used inside of 500 to print out the 1099 miscellaneous dividend and interest forms if you were doing the paper versions yourself, after they included the option for the Atrix integration. RKL did provide a blog post back in 2017 that talked about that transition, and that blog post does explore the different service level options. So if you want Atrix to perform the distribution of the forms to the recipients, but you want to take care of the filing yourself to the IRS, you have that choice. You can pick and choose from a variety of options there, and the pricing is laid out, I believe, on that on a link that's on that blog post as well. It is basically a per transaction and I believe a one-time setup fee to enroll in the Atrix service. That blog post also references the supported versions of 500 in which you can use the Atrix solution, and I will be reaching out to get that blog post updated to include the latest version of 500 if it's not already included. Another note for 1099s for this year. If you're using 1099 miscellaneous and you're reporting non-employee compensation in box 7, then those forms are due by January 31st of 2019. For all other 1099 forms, if you're filing them on paper, those are due February 28th. If you're filing electronically, they're not due until April 1st. So obviously the IRS is doing what it can to encourage folks to file electronically by granting them another full month to get the electronic filing done. And obviously it's less time consuming for them to process if the files are received electronically than going through the paper themselves. The options below for the IRS FIRE, the Filing Information Returns Electronically service, have not changed. But if you are required to file 250 or more returns of any one form, so if you need to produce 250 or more form 1099 miscellaneous, or 250 or more 1099 interest, or 250 or more 1099 dividend forms, you are required to use the electronic filing that's available directly through the IRS. And if that requirement does fall into your company's parameters, then you need to make sure that you filed IRS Form 4419 at least 30 days before the 1099 form that you're filing is due. So if you plan to use the FIRE processing for your Form 1099 miscellaneous, those forms are due January 31st, which means you need to file Form 4419 by December 31st in order for the IRS to approve you for that FIRE filing process. We've also included links in the presentation here to provide instructions for each of the 3 1099 forms that are supported within Sage 500. So that will take you directly to the IRS website, which will include all the information I've shared here, as well as details on filling out the forms field by field. If you are processing your 1099s within Sage 500, you do have some options for editing the 1099 payment amounts that Sage has captured. So there are really only two instances where you should need to edit any of the 1099 data. The first would be the Edit Voucher 1099 Data task on the Activities menu. And that would be used if the vendor's 1099 status had changed at some point mid-year. So if at the beginning of the year you were not tracking 1099s for a specific vendor, and then February or March rolled around and you realized you were going to need to track 1099 payments for that vendor and then changed the 1099 tracking within maintained vendors, making that change to the 1099 type at the vendor level does not go back and change any posted vouchers that have already been processed, nor does it change any that may have been in a pending batch at the time that you made that change. That change would only take effect for new vouchers entered after that point for the vendor. So if that scenario played out in your company, you may have made payments to the vendor before capturing any 1099 information, or perhaps the vendor was initially set up with the wrong 1099 form, set up as 1099 dividend by mistake instead of 1099 miscellaneous, for example. So the Edit Voucher 1099 Data task can be used to see for all vouchers that have been paid for the vendor, the dollar amount that was captured as a 1099 payment. You can change it as needed in that task. The second option would apply if you started using Sage 500's accounts payable mid-year and had already made payments to your vendors that were 1099 reportable earlier in the year on some other system. So if you migrated to Sage 500 in April and had already cut checks to your vendors on another system January through April, then the amounts that you had paid from that other system can be entered in the 1099 beginning balances field, because presumably you may not have brought over the voucher detail to be able to capture those payments from the other system. So if those two scenarios don't apply, then editing 1099 payment amounts should not be a concern for you. How do you validate the information that's out there for your 1099 payments? There are a couple of standard Explore views. So under the Insights Explore folder within Accounts Payable, you've got the Explore Vendors task and the Explore Vendor Payments task. Those are both good starts, but unfortunately, neither of them is really complete for looking at 1099 information. For example, the Explore Vendors task doesn't show you the last payment date. So if you wanted to get a list of all vendors you had paid for the current year, that Explore Vendors task won't work for you. It also does not include, out of the box, the 1099 type field. The Explore Vendor Payments task obviously will allow you to filter by date, so you can, in that task, see all the vendors that you had paid for the current year. Unfortunately, it doesn't include any of the 1099 data, so you would see all payments to all vendors regardless of whether they're 1099 reportable or not. So we've had several requests over the years to provide our customers with Explore tasks that are a little bit more meaningful, more targeted to 1099 tracking. So we developed these three custom Explores, one that shows a 3-year vendor payment history, another that shows vendors that are missing any 1099 payments. So those would be vendors who are currently set as 1099 reporting, who had payments which were not tagged as 1099 payments. And then a vendor list with the 1099 type and the last payment date. So you can get a quick list of all of the vendors for a particular form who payments were issued to in the current year, for example. So if you're interested in getting any or all of those Explore tasks, we're offering them at the same price we did last year, $200 per Explore, presuming that they're delivered as is, or $500 for the set of all three. So if you're interested in any of those, you can feel free to reach out to either Gia Lane or Mike Scher, your customer account manager, or reach out to one of your RKL consultants. So once the data has been validated within 500, you can then use either the new Atrix solution or the old form printing solution within 500. If you're going to use the new Atrix solution, you'll find it under the 1099 Forms 2016 Plus task. If you're using the older Crystal Report version, it'll be listed on the menu as 1099 Forms pre-2016. Again, just keep in mind that the Crystal Report forms themselves have not been updated to reflect IRS changes since the 2016 tax year. So if you're using the printed forms, caveat emptor. You'll find both of those tasks under the Insights folder, Reports subfolder, and then the 1099 Reports folder within there. If you're sick of 1099 processing altogether, there is a way to avoid it. If you use a credit card to pay your vendors, then those payments are not reported by you. They are instead falling to the credit card issuer to report on Form 1099-K. So if you've got a corporate American Express card and you pay your vendors with the Amex card, then Amex is responsible for both reporting those payments to the IRS and issuing the 1099 forms to the appropriate recipients. So if you want to use the credit card, you can alleviate the responsibility of 1099 tracking altogether. So let's talk a little bit about what's safe to prune from the database and what may not be safe to prune. First, each module has a post batches task on the activities menu, and you can use that to see any pending batches for that company for that module. So it's a good idea to visit that task probably every month end, if not more often, to see if there are any pending batches sitting out there that can either be deleted or that need to be posted through completion. You can also confirm within each module, under the maintenance folder for each module, there is a setup folder, and inside that a setup XX options, where XX represents the 2-character module ID. So setup AP options, for example, in accounts payable. Each of those setup options tasks has a data retention tab with various fields for how long the system will keep transactions, history, and log information for that module. So you'll want to review those settings. They only kick in, those retention settings only kick in if you do a purge within a module, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. I'm going a little bit out of order from the bullet points here, but just a note, you probably already know this, but within Sage 500, it's generally recommended that you perform closings in this order. So you would start with the inventory module before closing out the accounts payable module. Purchase order doesn't have any separate module closing option. When payables closes, PO closes. Then you would move on to accounts receivable, and similarly, the sales order module does not have its own month-end close. It closes when when the accounts receivable module has closed. Once those are completed, you would move on to cash management, then multi-currency if you're using multi-currency, and general ledger last. So circling back on the purge. In general, we don't recommend using any of the purge tasks that are found within the process period end task itself or on the utilities menu for primarily two reasons. One, you may find that those are actually kind of anemic, where they spin for minutes or hours and don't actually remove anything because they ran into an error. Or you may find that the purge is successful, but it may leave some records orphaned. You may have a header for a voucher that remains intact, but all the detail lines for it are gone, for example. Older versions of 500 are more susceptible to those purge issues, but in general, we've found that they can provide sort of a struggle. So I would suggest reaching out to your RKL consultant to talk through any of those purges if you are concerned about freeing up space or if systems become slow. There are some things that are completely safe to purge, and within each of these you'll have an XX month field that you can fill in to dictate how far back the data is purged. So within the purchase order module, you'll have the opportunity to purge closed POs, closed receivers or returns to vendor, and closed requisitions. In the sales order module, you've got the opportunity to remove closed sales orders, expired quotes, and fully posted shipments, returns, and RMAs. In the manufacturing module, you can remove closed work orders. And in the system manager module, which people probably don't spend a whole lot of time in, there is an activity log that can grow fairly large. That activity log keeps a record of when period end processing has been done for each module within each company. If you've run a purge, that will also be tracked in the System Manager activity log. Changes that you may make to your security groups or to your users, and then postings, GL postings to the suspense accounts that are defined in setup options. All of those things are tracked in the activity log along with some other data. So you may want to consider purging that information at some point as well. Other things that you might want to be mindful of, if you are deleting users, if you've had turnover and you want to take some of the folks who are set up as users within 500 and revoke their privileges, there is an option to delete the user in the maintain users task within 500, but that does not remove the user from the SQL database. So there's a separate step that would have to be run if you truly want that user out of the system. To be able to either delete the user from SQL or to block them from logging into SQL. So feel free to reach out to RKL for assistance with that as needed. You may also have demo companies that were installed in your database when 500 was first set up for you. If you wish to get rid of those demo companies, then we can assist with that process. There is actually a delete company task within 500 that'll allow you to delete those, but there are some caveats. If intercompany transactions have occurred between that company and another company, there's a specific order that you need to flow through. So again, if that's something that you're interested in doing, reach out to whoever you work with at RKL so that we can help coach you through that process. And there are also a couple of specific SQL tables that are listed here that are generally safe to purge through a given point in time. But again, please reach out to your RKL consultant so that we can walk you through any concerns that there may be regarding those specific tables. A few best practices. There is a new option starting in version 2017 in Maintain Natural Accounts to be able to set a GL accounts status to either inactive or deleted. And within Maintain Natural Accounts, there's an option to apply that change to any associated GL account. So if you take the time to review accounts that should not be used any longer or perhaps were set up incorrectly, you can flip their status to deleted to prevent users from posting transactions to those accounts going forward. Setting the status to deleted won't remove any history for the GL account. It simply prevents the user from being able to post to that account going forward. If you're tracking your budgets in 500, then you have a couple of considerations. In the GL setup options task, there is an option for, or a couple of options for how you might want to roll your budgets forward if you want to copy from an existing budget when you close the year, or if you want to copy from the actual balances for the end of the year into your budget for the coming year, or do no copy at all. If you wish to do so, you're certainly free to do so. You can also use the maintain budgets and revise budgets tasks, either in addition to that option to do the rollover, or to completely handle the budget process manually. Within the maintain budgets task, there is a copy budget option that allows you to copy from a previously defined budget into a new budget and allow some either percent or dollar amount over or under the previous budget amount. That task is designed for you to maintain for a single GL account at a time, and you've got the opportunity to either update the budget amount for the entire year or each period individually. The revise budget task is a lot more comprehensive, allows you to select multiple GL accounts, a range of accounts, or even all accounts. And again, gives you the same opportunities to do percent or dollar increases over previous budgets or actuals to create the new budget amount as your starting point. Since that is a more comprehensive process, it does require a register post tasks for you to be able to review those changes before they are put in effect. Year-end is also a great time to review your inventory replenishment defaults if you are licensed for the replenishment module, taking a look at the methods that you're using within replenishment for min-max or EOQ. Also taking a look at any formulas that you may be using for demand calculation or purchase requirements from your vendors, etc. Also a great time for you to use the purchase order vendor performance report, which you can filter by vendor, by warehouse, by item, or any combination of those. That can be a great tool for you to use when you sit down with your vendor to negotiate a contract for coming year's prices for the items that you purchase from them. And if you're using the manufacturing module, then you also want to take a look at your overhead rates to make sure that those are still accurate, check the variances against standard, and do your bill of material cost roll-up. So getting ready for the coming year, you may need to set up a new inventory calendar. So if you haven't already defined the 2019 year in inventory management's setup IM options, on the miscellaneous tab, there's an inventory calendar button. You can click the look up, the little magnifying glass to see what years have been defined already, or you can click the button to add a new year. When that new year pops open, it will default the number of work days and the end dates to match up with what was defined for the previous year. You've got the opportunity to edit those end dates or edit those work days in that grid before saving. When you do that save, it will prompt you to recalculate the inventory balances. And when you do so, it may take some time. So you might want to ensure that you do that either perhaps on a weekend or when you know that there are no users in the system. Likewise, you may need to set up a new GL fiscal calendar. So if you have not yet defined 2019 in the general ledger module, this is your opportunity to do that. The inventory calendar and the GL calendar can be done at any point in advance. So if you wanted to go out and create 2019, 2020, 2021 all this week, that's perfectly fine. It just sets those up as available to be posted to based on the rules that you've got defined at each module. Before you do the inventory calendar change or the GL calendar change, we do recommend that you do a backup of the database, just because each of those tasks does go through its own recalculation utility, and we want to ensure that if anything goes wrong during that recalc, that you've got a restore point to kick back to. So again, in GL maintenance, you've got the opportunity to do a lookup of what years already exist and click an Add Year button to create the new year, and it will display a message letting you know that beginning balances will be calculated. There is a specific transaction type in General Ledger called a BB, beginning balance type, and if you've used those, that can lead to issues with the recalculation. The recalculation can actually drop transactions that are flagged as beginning balances, which can cause your balance sheet and P&L balances to go askew. So if you do have those beginning balance transactions, it's best to reach out to RKL to have us assist with that process before you fire that new fiscal year creation. Again, you want to confirm the end dates that it has defined for each period. And in newer versions, you also have the options to lock individual modules, payables, receivables, cash management, inventory, manufacturing, or do a lock-unlock for all modules for each period to prevent postings to those. If you're using Sage FAS, it may or may not be integrated with Sage 500's accounts payable and purchase order modules. You can verify that by going into Setup AP Options and looking on the Integration tab. If the box for fixed asset accounting is checked, then there should be a populated value in the database and company fields, which tells you the FAS database name and the FAS company that's associated with the selected Sage 500 company. So if you're integrated with FAS from 500's accounts payable module, then you want to ensure that you're running a version of FAS that is compatible with your version of 500. The Sage 500 compatibility guide will specify which versions of FAS are supported for your version of 500. If you're not integrated to FAS, then by all means install the most recent version of FAS available, and version 2019 is going to be coming presumably within the next week or so. There's also a menu upgrade utility within 500. If you've gone through an upgrade, there may be new tasks that are available to you, which may or may not have been added to your menus that you're using within your system. So you can launch this menu upgrade utility. It's kind of well hidden. You need to go to the folder where the 500 install was done and then browse to the path that I've shown here on the slide and look for this accounting.framework.menuupgradeutility.exe. That will launch and show you on one side all of the standard tasks, and on the other side for the menu you've selected, the tasks that are available, and you can simply drag and drop the standard tasks into your custom menu as needed. This is also a great time for you to review your 500 users' roles and responsibilities. So again, if you've had employees who have left the company or have had users whose responsibilities have changed throughout the year, this is a great time to ensure that they have permissions to all the things they need and revoke permissions for things they may not need. And just a note, you can assign multiple security groups to any one user. And if you do that, 500 permissions are inclusive. So if one security group that the user is assigned to prevents them from launching a task, but another group that they're assigned to grants that permission, the user will be granted the higher level of access from the group that allows it. I want to start by focusing on disaster recovery plans. This has been a topic of conversation at RKL because unfortunately we've had a couple of clients that have run into issues either with a ransomware virus where hackers broke into their network and held their data hostage. We've also had a couple of clients within the last couple of months who have had various server issues, which have caused them some downtime and some lost data. So we don't want that to happen to you. And we wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about disaster recovery plan to hopefully educate you, make you aware of things that you should be considering, and if you don't already have a plan in process, to hopefully get you thinking about creating one for your company. So a disaster recovery plan, which I'm abbreviating here as a DRP, is really just a guidebook that allows you to, in the event of an emergency, know who that you need to reach out to, what tasks need to be done and who's responsible for each of those tasks, and includes things like what kinds of threats are we subject to, right? So all of us are subject to weather-related threats, whether that be a hurricane, tornado, or some other catastrophe like a fire that consumes the building, right? So we're all subject to those, but we're also subject potentially to issues where a hacker has breached our network and may want to get in and either destroy or hold our data hostage. So the point of the disaster recovery plan is to identify what the potential threats are, what the consequences of those threats might be, and then break those down into three categories: things that we can prevent, things that we can detect before they get too far along in the process, and correction steps that we can take if we've identified that a threat has occurred. So we want to make sure that you've got a plan in place to get replacement hardware, so that if you were unfortunately the victim of a fire or something happens and your server goes completely down, we want to make sure that you've got a plan in place to quickly replace that hardware, or that you've got some off-site location where the hardware is already up and running and you can simply flip a switch. I'll make it sound easy, although it's not quite that easy, but effectively flip a switch to get up and running on that other system. If you don't have a disaster recovery plan, or you feel like you need another set of eyes on your existing plan, then please reach out to whoever you rely on for your IT services. If you don't have anyone in-house or a third party that you've contracted with and you want to reach out to RKL, our infrastructure team would be happy to work with you on either designing a DRP or reviewing the one that you have in place to make sure that it fits your needs. So all of that said, regardless of the general disaster recovery plan that you may have in place, there are some SQL-specific things that you need to be concerned with since Sage 500 runs on a SQL database. The first is that you want to make sure that you're testing your backup and recovery procedures. So even if you've got, let's say, a nightly backup happening, and your IT folks assure you that that backup is stored off-site and makes you feel comfortable, if no one has actually tested restoring data from that backup, then you don't know what you might be facing in the event of a critical event occurring where you need to make that restore happen quickly, right? So you want to make sure that people have tested that process so it's a comfortable series of steps for them, not something that they're learning when they're under the pressure to get the database restored. And then depending on your database recovery model, there are three different options within SQL for simple, full, and bulk logged recovery models. Depending which one your database for 500 is set to will dictate the process that the restore steps have to be followed. So if you're doing, if you're using simple recovery model, then you need the last full backup to restore to. And if things have happened since that last full backup was taken, unfortunately, that data would be lost. If you're using a full recovery model for your database, then in addition to perhaps a nightly full backup, you should also have periodic transaction log backups that might be taken perhaps hourly. And in the event that you've got those backup files available, you could then restore your full backup and then to the most recent hourly transaction log backup to minimize the amount of data that you may lose. So You need to identify what the recovery model is and then plan accordingly based on that model. You also want to make sure that whatever backup media you're using, whether you're backing up simply to files on a server or whether you're backing up to a tape drive or some external drive, that media is kept off-site. Unfortunately, one of the clients that I mentioned earlier who ran into an issue was doing their backups on the same drive as the database resided, and when they fell victim to the ransomware virus, not only was that hacker in control of their actual database, but also all of the backups that they had for the database. So you want to make sure that those are physically separated from your SQL server. You also want to ensure that you've got copies of your SQL install media, whether those are files that you downloaded from Microsoft or a CD or a DVD with the SQL installation files on it, as well as your product keys for your SQL license or licenses, so that if you do need to spin up a new server, you've got all of that information and that data handy to be able to get that install done quickly. There are also some passwords and potentially some encryption keys that you want to make sure that you've got stored safely. So your SQL database has at least one system administrator account. You want to make sure that you know what that password is and that is kept safe. And if you're processing credit cards within Sage 500, there are also some encryption keys that are required to encrypt the credit card data that's stored in 500. So you want to make sure that you've got those keys available too. And we do have a blog post about those database encryption keys relating to credit card processing on RKL's website. I've listed a couple of resources here for you to get more information on specifically SQL disaster recovery. And we're not necessarily endorsing either of these web pages, but wanted to make you aware that there are several out there that I could have picked from. I like Paul Randall's site because it gives you a very high-level introduction to the disaster recovery process. So it's a good starting point for folks who may not be terribly familiar with the disaster recovery. And then Brent Ozar's site is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. This link will take you to a 50-page white paper that goes into a lot of detail with step-by-step tasks for doing SQL recovery, in this case using, I believe it's Google's cloud solution. So again, not endorsing either of those solutions, just want to give you some options to get you thinking.